Mary Beth Tinning. Between 1972 and 1985, Mary Beth Tinning buried 9 of her own children in Schenectady County, New York. Every one of them died young. Every one of them died while in her care. And for 13 years, the doctors and the coroners and the social workers who looked at those small bodies kept writing down the same kinds of words on the death certificates: sudden infant death syndrome, undetermined cause, natural causes, 9 times in a row. The reigning theory among local physicians was that the Tinning family must carry some rare, hidden genetic disorder, something nobody had identified yet, something quietly killing their babies one after another. That theory finally collapsed in 1981, when the child who died in her care was the one she had adopted. Mary Beth Rowe Tinning was born in Duanesburg, New York, on September 11, 1942. By her early 30s, she was settled in Schenectady, married to a General Electric employee named Joseph Tinning, and on the outside, she looked like any other young Catholic mother on her block. The first death came in January of 1972, when her infant daughter Jennifer died of meningitis. Investigators who later combed through the case files would conclude that this was the only one of the 9 deaths that was genuinely natural. What happened over the next 13 years strained belief. Just weeks after Jennifer's funeral, her 2-year-old son, Joseph Jr., was rushed to the hospital in cardiac arrest and pronounced dead. 2 months after that, her 4-year-old daughter Barbara died after a seizure. The following year, her 3-week-old son Timothy was labeled a SIDS death. Then Nathan, 5 months old, attributed to acute pulmonary edema. Then Mary Frances, 3 months old, SADS. Then Jonathan, 3 months old, undetermined. By the time her adopted son Michael died at age 3 in 1981, supposedly of pneumonia, the local medical community was finally starting to ask the question they should have asked years earlier. Because Michael was not biologically related to anyone in the Tinning family. Whatever was killing those children, it was not a gene, and somehow, it gets worse. In December of 1985, Tinning brought 4-month-old Tammy Lynn to the emergency room, her 9th and last child. The New York State Police finally opened an investigation, pulled Tinning in for questioning, and on February 4, 1986, she signed a written statement admitting that she had been responsible for the deaths of Tammy Lynn and 2 of her sons, Timothy and Nathan. She wrote that she had done it because she did not believe she was a good mother, and because of the other children. Prosecutors indicted her in 3 of the deaths, but ultimately tried her only for Tammy Lynn. Her trial in Schenectady County Court ran 6 weeks under Judge Clifford Harrigan. The county medical examiner testified that Tammy Lynn had not died of natural causes. A pathologist from the SIDS Foundation backed him up. Tinning's husband, Joseph, testified that after the police interview, his wife had come home and told him she had taken Tammy's life. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for the better part of 3 days, and on July 17, 1987, convicted her of depraved indifference murder. District Attorney John Porsche called her a wicked woman who had known the consequences of every act. She was sentenced to 20 years to life and entered Taconic Correctional Facility on the Bedford Hills campus that October. For decades, the theory most often attached to the Tinning case has been Munchausen syndrome by proxy. The pattern fits the textbook description: a mother who appears devoted, who craves the sympathy and attention that comes with a sick or dying child, who induces illness to keep that attention flowing. Tinning herself was never formally diagnosed in court, but at her 2011 parole hearing, she offered a partial explanation. She said that after the deaths of her other children, she had simply lost it, that she had become damaged and worthless, that when Tammy Lynn was small, she had believed the baby was going to die too. So she had made it happen. 2 years later, in 2013, she told the parole board that she knew she had done it, but she could not tell them why. The parole board denied her 6 times. On the 7th hearing in July of 2018, they let her go. On August 21, 2018, at 75 years old, Marybeth Tinning walked out of Taconic after more than 31 years inside. Her husband Joseph, never charged with anything, was waiting in the parking lot to pick her up. State corrections records show she was discharged from post-release supervision in July of 2023. 8 of those 9 death certificates were eventually understood to be lies. 8 children lost across 13 years in the same small house to the same woman, while every system meant to catch her looked at the evidence and wrote down the wrong words again and again. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The pattern of a mother who could not stop, who turned the people meant to help her children into an audience, becomes important when you look at the woman in our second case. Because she did not need a hospital ward to put on the show. She had a smartphone. Lacey Spears. For most of her son Garnett's short life, Lacey Spears was the kind of mother that strangers prayed for online. She kept a blog called Garnett's Journey. She posted to Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter at all hours of the night. She documented every hospital visit, every IV line, every setback, every supposed miracle recovery. By the time her son was about a year old, she was already telling her followers that he had been admitted to the hospital for the 23rd time. People sent prayers. People sent money. Strangers in other states sent casseroles to the door. What none of them knew, and what doctors at Westchester Medical Center would eventually piece together in the last week of January 2014, was that the illness Lacey Spears had been chronicling for 5 years was something she was creating. Lacey Spears was born in October of 1987, and she was in her mid-20s when she settled in Chestnut Ridge, New York, inside a holistic, intentional community called the Fellowship. Her son, Garnett Paul Thompson Spears, was born in December of 2008. She told friends and her online following that Garnett's father had been a police officer named Blake, killed in a car accident before the baby was born. There was no Blake. Garnett's biological father was a man named Chris Hill, who was alive in Alabama and had been pushed out of the picture before he ever met the boy. From the time Garnett was an infant, Lacey insisted he was constantly sick. A gastric feeding tube was placed when he was around 9 months old. Over the next 4 years, he was hospitalized so many times that even his own pediatricians struggled to keep an accurate count. Through all of it, his mother was a fixture in waiting rooms, in hospital chapels, online. She gave Garnett's illness a name and a face and a hashtag. And when she walked into Nyack Hospital on January 17, 2014, telling the staff that her 5-year-old son was having seizures, she was operating inside a medical system that already knew her. But this time, something did not add up. Garnett's sodium levels when he arrived were within the normal range. Within hours, those levels began climbing. Then they spiked to a number the treating physicians later described in court as metabolically impossible. A level that high, in a child his age, cannot occur naturally. The pediatric ICU team at Westchester Medical Center, where Garnett was transferred, recognized what they were looking at and quietly placed a call to Child Protective Services. Garnett was declared dead on January 23, 2014. And no, I am not making that up. Investigators served search warrants on Lacey's home. What they recovered was staggering in scope. Feeding bags containing enormous amounts of sodium. One of them, according to a prosecutor's later filing, held the equivalent of roughly 69 small restaurant salt packets. A friend of Lacey's came forward and testified that Lacey had asked her to remove a feeding bag from the apartment as the situation began to unravel. Hospital surveillance video showed Lacey twice taking Garnett, with his connector tube, into a private bathroom shortly before his condition collapsed. Her trial ran for 2.5 weeks in Westchester County Court. Prosecutors from District Attorney Janet DeFiore's office argued that Lacey had used her son's medical equipment against him. Assistant District Attorney Doreen Lloyd told the jury that what Lacey had done was beyond depraved, beyond despicable, and evil. Her co-prosecutor, Patricia Murphy, acknowledged that the motive was bizarre and frightening, but said that the motive existed. The state's theory was that Lacey had been harming Garnett over and over since infancy in order to harvest sympathy and attention online. That she had built her entire adult identity around being the mother of a miraculously sick child, and that when that identity began to wobble, she escalated. The defense, led by attorney Stephen Riebling, did not formally raise Munchausen syndrome by proxy as a legal defense. They argued instead that the hospital had made mistakes and that the state could not place a syringe in Lacey's hand. Lacey did not testify. On March 2, 2015, the jury convicted her of second-degree depraved murder and first-degree manslaughter. Westchester County Court Justice Robert Neary, when he came to sentencing on April 8, did something unusual. He acknowledged openly that he believed Lacey Spears suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. He said that he was giving her 20 years to life, below the maximum of 25 to life, in order to show her the mercy she had not provided to her son. But he also called the crime unfathomable in its cruelty. The conviction was upheld on appeal. Garnett Paul Thompson Spears died at 5 years old. He had spent most of his short life either in a hospital bed or on his way to one, while the woman everyone trusted to protect him sat next to him updating her status. He was the centerpiece of a story that thousands of strangers followed in real time, sending love and prayer to a mother they could not see, for an illness she was manufacturing in the dark. Lacey Spears is currently incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, and she is not eligible for parole consideration until around 2034. That makes 2 women in a row who killed because of something broken inside them. Greed had nothing to do with it. The woman in our third case built her entire life around greed, and the body count followed her into her 70s. Sante Quimes. A career con artist's first rule is supposed to be knowing when to stop. Sante Quimes never did. For more than 4 decades, she ran scams up and down the country, married her way into a fortune, was convicted under federal anti-slavery laws for what she did to her own household staff, and somehow always slipped back out the other side. The crimes grew bigger as she got older. Then, in the summer of 1998, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, an 82-year-old former Radio City Music Hall dancer named Irene Silverman walked out of her own $7 million townhouse and was never seen again. Her body has never been found, and Sante Quimes was the last person known to be plotting against her. Sante Quimes was born in July of 1934, and by her teens she was already running short cons. She would grow up to be the kind of woman a Vanity Fair writer could describe by a single nickname: the Dragon Lady. Sometime in the early 1970s, she married a wealthy Nevada and California motel developer named Kenneth Quimes Sr., whose estimated fortune at the time would translate to well over $100 million in today's money. Their son, Kenneth Jr., was born in March of 1975. He grew up watching his mother work. Her record over the years that followed was almost too long to summarize. She was arrested for stealing a mink coat from a Washington, D.C. restaurant. She was caught impersonating Elizabeth Taylor. She was tied to insurance fraud, suspected of multiple arson fires and accused of identity theft and forgery in 3 different states. In 1985, federal authorities prosecuted her under anti-slavery statutes for holding young, often undocumented women as captive household servants, beating them, and refusing to pay them. She was sentenced to multiple concurrent 5-year terms and served roughly 3 years in federal prison. Her husband, Kenneth Sr., died in 1994. After that, the scam stopped being only about money. By the summer of 1998, Sante and her grown son, Kenneth Jr., had identified a new target. Irene Silverman, 82 years old, lived alone in a 4-story limestone townhouse on East 65th Street that she sometimes rented out to vetted boarders. The building was worth $7 million and was held in Silverman's name with no surviving close family. Kenneth Jr. rented a room from her under a false name, Manny Guerin, and began documenting her routines. Silverman, who had been a chorus dancer her entire adult life and had a working performer's instincts about people, started to notice. She kept written notes about her new tenant. He never let her into his room. He gave evasive answers about who he was. She decided to evict him. On July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman vanished from inside her own home. That same afternoon, Sante and Kenneth Jr. were arrested in Manhattan on an unrelated Utah warrant. What investigators found in their car and luggage built a case almost by itself. They had Silverman's keys. They had her passport. They had a forged deed transferring the townhouse to Akeem's-controlled shell corporation for $395,000, a tiny fraction of what the building was worth. They had taped recordings of Silverman's phone calls. They had plastic handcuffs, masks, a stun gun box, and a syringe of a date rape-type drug. And they had Sante's own notebooks, written in her own hand, laying out the entire scheme. That is not a typo, by the way. Sante Kaimes had written a step-by-step plan for taking Irene Silverman's identity and her townhouse, and she had kept the notebook in her bag. Kenneth Jr. would later confess that after his mother stunned Silverman with a stun gun, he ended her life, placed her body in a duffel bag, and dumped her in a Hoboken dumpster. Her remains were never recovered. The mother and son were tried together in 2000 in Manhattan before Judge Raina Uveler, in a case prosecutors had to build with no body, no crime scene, and no eyewitness to the killing. They were convicted on 118 separate charges, including murder, robbery, conspiracy, forgery, grand larceny, and illegal eavesdropping. Sante received roughly 120 years. Kenneth Jr. received about 125. At sentencing, Sante compared the trial to the Salem witch trials and accused the prosecutors of murdering the Constitution. Judge Uveler called her a sociopath and called her son a remorseless predator. That was only round one. In 2004, both were extradited to California to stand trial for the 1998 murder of a Los Angeles businessman named David Kasdan, whose signature Sante had forged on a $280,000 loan. When Kasdan threatened to go to the police, Kenneth Jr. shot him in the back of the head and dumped his body in a trash bin near the airport. To avoid the death penalty, Kenneth Jr. pleaded guilty and testified against his own mother. He also confessed, on the stand, to a third killing, that of a Bahamian banker named Syed Bilal Ahmed, drowned during one of his mother's 1996 offshore scams. Sante was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy called her one of the most evil individuals she had ever sentenced. Sante Kaimes died inside Bedford Hills Correctional Facility on May 19, 2014, at 79 years old. She never expressed remorse for any of it. Kenneth Jr. is still serving life in California. Greed drove Santa Caimes. The woman in our fourth case did not kill for money or attention or politics. She killed two small children whose parents had paid her, trusted her, and traveled with her on family vacations. Jocelyn Ortega. On the afternoon of October 25, 2012, a young Manhattan mother named Marina Krim got into the elevator of her Upper West Side apartment building with her 3-year-old daughter, expecting to meet her nanny and her 2 other children at a dance class a few blocks away. They never arrived. Marina rode the elevator back up to her family's apartment. She unlocked her own front door. And what she found inside the bathroom of her home is something that the doorman, the building staff, the responding officers, and the prosecutors who later tried the case all said, in their own words, they would never be able to forget. The woman who had done it was in the same room, still alive, having turned the same weapon on herself. Jocelyn Ortega, known to the Krim family as Josie, was about 50 years old at the time. She had come to the United States from the Dominican Republic, eventually becoming a naturalized citizen, and had worked for the Krim family for around 2 years as a live-in nanny for their 3 young children. Lucia, called Lulu by everyone who knew her, was 6 years old. Her little brother Leo was 2. The middle child, Nessie, was 3. Marina and her husband, Kevin Krim, a digital media executive, lived in a doorman building called La Rochelle on the Upper West Side, and they had treated Josie as something close to family. They had paid for her flights home to the Dominican Republic. They had vacationed with her there. And in the weeks leading up to that October afternoon, they had been quietly trying to give her extra income because they knew she was under financial strain. Her teenage son had recently moved to New York City, and she had enrolled him in private school. They wanted to help. What none of them knew was that the references and background information her family had provided when she was hired had been falsified. They also did not know that her mental health had been deteriorating for some time, and that her own family had been hiding the signs from the people who had welcomed her into their home. Kevin Krim was returning from a business trip that evening. He landed at JFK, looked at his phone, and saw missed calls. NYPD officers were waiting for him at the airport. They told him what had happened inside his family's bathroom that afternoon. They told him that 2 of his 3 children were gone. He would later testify in court about being brought to the medical examiner's office to identify his son and his daughter. He spoke about the way their skin still looked, the way their long eyelashes still looked, the way they appeared as if someone had tried very hard to clean them but had not quite managed it. He said the memory never left him. Jocelyn Ortega had been found alive in the same bathroom with serious self-inflicted injuries to her neck and throat. She was taken to the hospital, kept alive by emergency surgery, and eventually transported to Rikers Island to await trial. The case took more than 5 years to reach a jury. Her defense, led by attorney Valerie Van Leer Greenberg, would ultimately rest on a claim of not guilty by reason of insanity. A psychiatrist named Karen Rosenbaum testified that Ortega had been hearing voices, that she described commands from the devil, and that she could not appreciate the nature of what she had done. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office did not buy it. Lead prosecutor Stuart Silberg, working under District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr., argued the opposite. He argued that Jocelyn Ortega had not acted out of psychosis. He argued that she had acted out of jealous, calculated rage against the happier and more comfortable life she watched Marina Krim live every day. He told the jury that she had done what she had done intentionally, with a full understanding of every motion. The trial lasted roughly 7 weeks. On April 18, 2018, the jury rejected the insanity defense and convicted her of 2 counts each of first-degree and second-degree murder. Sentencing came less than a month later. On May 14, 2018, Justice Gregory Caro of the New York Supreme Court sentenced Jocelyn Ortega to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He called her pure evil. He said that she and her family had hidden her mental condition from the Crims, and that the Crims had been entitled to know exactly who they were leaving their children with. Marina Krim addressed the court directly. She told Ortega that the defendant might think she had destroyed Lulu and Leo, but that in this she was a failure too, because Lulu and Leo were 2 stars now, and those stars would always lead the family forward. Kevin Krim called Ortega an evil and dangerous narcissist. He said she should live and rot and die in a metal case. Marina and Kevin Krim went on to found a charity in their children's name, the Lulu and Leo Fund, which supports arts education for children across the country under a program called Choose Creativity. They went on to have 2 more children. They continue, more than a decade later, to do that work in their children's memory. Jocelyn Ortega is currently serving her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She will die there. Some of the women on this list are easy to call evil. The 2 women in our 5th case are harder. They believed they were soldiers in a war that nobody else had agreed to fight. The price of that belief was paid by 3 men with badges who happened to be standing in the wrong intersection on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Kathy Boudin and Judith Clark. On the afternoon of October 20th, 1981, a Brinks armored car pulled up to the Nanuet Mall in Rockland County, New York, to pick up a routine deposit. Within minutes, a Brinks guard was dead on the pavement, a second was bleeding out behind the wheel, and $1.6 million in cash had been loaded into the back of a red U-Haul truck. The robbers got onto the New York State Thruway. Police set up a hasty roadblock at the next exit. When the truck rolled to a stop, 2 men jumped from the back firing semi-automatic rifles, killing 2 more officers in seconds, including the first black police officer in the history of the Nyack Force. The robbery had been planned for months. The people who had planned it were not professional armed robbers. They were the last serious holdouts of a 1960s American revolutionary movement. And in the front seat of that U-Haul, smiling and unarmed and acting confused for the responding officers, was a 38-year-old woman from one of the most respected leftist families in Greenwich Village. The robbery was a joint operation between members of the Black Liberation Army and former members of the Weather Underground, working together under an offshoot group called the May 19th Communist Organization. They believed the stolen money would fund the next phase of armed struggle inside the United States. Brinks guard Peter Page was killed in the parking lot. Guard Joseph Trombino was shot multiple times and survived that day, only to be killed 20 years later in the September 11th attacks at the World Trade Center. At the Thruway exit roadblock, Sergeant Edward O'Grady, a Vietnam veteran with a wife and 3 children, and Officer Waverly Brown, a Korean War veteran and the first black officer ever hired in Nyack, were both shot and killed. Kathy Boudin was born in May of 1943 into a New York family that was practically a brand name in American legal and political circles. Her father, Leonard Boudin, was a famous civil liberties attorney. Her brother Michael would later become a federal appellate judge. Kathy joined the Weather Underground in the late 1960s and survived the 1970 townhouse bombing in Greenwich Village that killed 3 of her comrades when an improvised bomb went off in the basement. She spent the next 11 years on the run. Inside the U-Haul that October afternoon, Kathy Boudin was unarmed. Her role was decoy. When police stopped the truck at the roadblock, she stepped out of the cab with her hands up, told the officers the men in the back were just riding along, and asked them to please lower their guns. The officers lowered them. The men in the back of the truck opened fire seconds later. 2 officers died on the pavement. Boudin tried to flee on foot, was caught a short distance away, and gave her name to police as Barbara Edson. Judith Clark, the other woman tied to the Bedford Hills story, was the driver of one of the getaway cars. She did not pull a trigger that day either. But unlike Boudin, who would eventually plead out, Clark went to trial in a stance she called revolutionary. She refused to recognize the court's authority. She represented herself. She turned her trial into political theater. The judge gave her 75 years to life. Boudin, who eventually pleaded guilty in 1984 to felony murder and robbery in exchange for a sentence of 20 years to life, took a very different path inside the walls. At Bedford Hills, Kathy Boudin became one of the most influential inmates in the prison's history. She co-founded the AIDS Counseling and Education Program, known as ACE, at a moment when the women's prison was in the middle of the HIV epidemic. She earned a master's degree, becoming the first woman to earn one inside a New York State prison. She would later earn a doctorate in education from Columbia's Teachers College. Her son Chessa, who was 14 months old when she was arrested, was raised by former Weather Underground figures Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers. Chessa Boudin grew up to be a Rhodes Scholar and was elected District Attorney of San Francisco in 2019. Kathy Boudin was paroled in 2003 after 22 years inside. The Rockland County District Attorney's Office, the surviving Brinks employees, and the families of the dead officers fought her release. They lost. 5 years later, when Columbia University's School of Social Work hired her as an adjunct professor, the families and the local officials fought that too. The Orangetown Town Board passed a formal resolution against her hiring as recently as 2013. Boudin lived long enough to welcome her partner, David Gilbert, the father of her son and one of the original Brinks defendants, home from prison in 2021. She died of cancer on May 1, 2022, at 78 years old. Judith Clark transformed inside the walls too, over decades, in ways the prison system rarely sees. Inside the walls, she co-founded the ACE program alongside Boudin, trained service dogs through an inmate program, and earned multiple advanced degrees. In December of 2016, Governor Andrew Cuomo commuted her sentence from 75 years to life down to 35 years to life. The parole board denied her in April of 2017, then granted her release 2 years later. On April 17, 2019, after roughly 38 years inside, Judith Clark walked out of Bedford Hills. The Rockland County District Attorney's Office called the decision an atrocious travesty of justice. The families of Sergeant O'Grady, Officer Brown, and Mr. Page are still alive. They are still asking why the women who participated in the killings of their fathers and husbands have been allowed to give academic lectures and accept teaching jobs and walk free. 45 years on, that argument has not gotten any easier. If you're liking this video so far and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next half of this list. Awilda Lopez. A 6-year-old girl named Elisa Izquierdo was once described in the New York press as a modern Cinderella. Her father, Gustavo, was a Cuban immigrant chef who adored her. A Greek prince had offered to pay for her private schooling. She attended a Montessori program in Brooklyn that she loved, and in May of 1994, when her father died of cancer, the New York family court system took her out of the home of the relatives who wanted her and placed her, against her father's explicit dying wishes, with her biological mother. 18 months later, Elisa was dead. A New York City police lieutenant with 22 years on the force told reporters at the scene that he had never, in his entire career, seen worse done to a child. Awilda Lopez was a New York City mother with a long-running addiction to crack cocaine. Elisa had been born in February of 1989, drug-exposed at birth because of her mother's use during pregnancy, and had been placed in her father Gustavo's full custody almost immediately. Under his care, Elisa had thrived. She had been bright, gentle, a little serious. Prince Michael of Greece, who had met her through a chance encounter at her preschool, had reportedly offered to fund her schooling all the way through. Then Gustavo got sick. When Gustavo Izquierdo died of cancer in the spring of 1994, he left behind written wishes asking that his daughter be raised by his sister and her family. His sister filed a formal custody petition. Family court judge Phoebe Greenbaum overruled all of it. In 1994, Elisa was awarded to Awilda Lopez. From that point forward, the story becomes a question of how many warning signs a system can ignore. Over the next 18 months, Elisa was subjected to a pattern of mistreatment so extensive that the responding officers, the medical examiner, and the prosecutors who later handled the case used some version of the same phrase, the worst they had ever seen. Teachers at her school reported concerns. Neighbors heard her crying through the walls and called in tips. A federally funded parenting program worker who visited the home reported what she saw. Reports were filed with the New York City Child Welfare Administration again and again by people who could not get the agency to act. Lopez told relatives she believed her daughter was possessed by the devil. On the night of November 22, 1995, Awilda Lopez harmed her 6-year-old daughter fatally inside their Brooklyn apartment. Elisa never regained consciousness. Her mother left her where she was for hours. By the time emergency services were finally called the following day, the child was beyond saving. The autopsy that followed described findings consistent with prolonged and deliberate mistreatment. Investigators documented dozens of distinct marks on her body, and the pattern of those marks matched a piece of jewelry that her mother wore. Assistant District Attorney Donna Henkin, describing the case to the court, said that Elisa had been left unconscious in that apartment overnight with no help, no comfort, and no one to call for her. In June of 1996, Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, accepting responsibility in part to spare her surviving children from having to take the stand and testify about what they had witnessed. She was sentenced to 15 years to life. At Elisa's funeral, attended by roughly 300 mourners who had never met her in life, the officiating priest told the congregation that the little girl had been killed not only by her mother, but by the silence of every adult who had been told what was happening and had done nothing. The city was forced to answer. Governor George Pataki signed Elisa's law in February of 1996, breaking open the confidentiality rules that had allowed the Child Welfare Administration to operate without scrutiny. He said publicly that the system had horribly failed Elisa Izquierdo. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani dissolved the existing agency and replaced it with the Administration for Children's Services, the agency that still oversees child protection in New York City today. Every reform in that office can be traced back, at root, to one 6-year-old girl who should never have been sent home in the first place. Awilda Lopez was housed for most of her sentence at the Taconic Correctional Facility on the Bedford Hills campus. The parole board denied her in January of 2022. 3 months later, on April 19, 2022, the board reversed itself, and Lopez was released after 26 years behind bars. She walked free. Elisa Izquierdo had turned 6 only 10 months before her mother killed her. 10 years and 1 borough away, another mother and another child welfare agency were about to repeat almost every mistake from the Elisa Izquierdo case. almost line for line. Nixales, Santiago. In the first month of 2006, in a Bedford-Stuyvesant apartment in Brooklyn, a 7-year-old girl named Nix Mary Brown died of injuries inflicted by her stepfather, while her own mother stood by and did nothing. When investigators searched the apartment, they found a child whose body weighed close to half of what a child her age should weigh. They found the room where she had been kept. They found that the family refrigerator was full of food. And when they went back through the records, they found 8 separate reports that had been filed about her with the New York City child welfare system in the 15 months before her death. Every one of those reports had been closed without anyone doing what needed to be done. Nix Mary Brown was born in July of 1998. She died on January 11, 2006, in an apartment shared with her mother, Nixales Santiago, her stepfather, Cesar Rodriguez, and several siblings. The fatal beating, according to prosecutors, began over something the household called petty, a container of yogurt and a printer that no longer worked. Rodriguez was the one who delivered the blows that killed her. But Nix Mary's mother was in the next room. She had been in the next room for months. The case that emerged in court was not an isolated incident of violence. It was a documented pattern of confinement, starvation, and abuse, stretching back well over a year. Brooklyn prosecutors brought into evidence a portrait of a household that one of the trial judges, Justice Patricia DeMango, would describe from the bench as a house of horrors. Nix Mary had been restrained and confined for long stretches inside her own home. She had been kept away from food while the rest of the family ate. The medical examiner found that her body was consistent with severe and prolonged neglect. Educational records showed she had been missing from her school for somewhere between 46 and 56 days in the months before her death. But the part of the case that became a New York City scandal was not what happened inside the apartment. It was what had happened, and not happened, outside of it. The city's Administration for Children's Services, the agency that had been created in part because of what happened to Elisa Izquierdo a decade earlier, had received at least 8 separate reports about Nix Mary Brown between October of 2004 and December of 2005. There were reports of educational neglect, reports of burns, direct allegations of physical abuse, and notifications from her school. And nothing meaningful was done about any of them. Caseworkers closed files without ever entering the home. Caseworkers failed to obtain medical records they had legal consent to obtain. When access to the apartment was denied, no court orders were sought. A caseworker who did not speak Spanish had been assigned to a family that primarily spoke it. The fallout was institutional. After Nix Mary's death, multiple ACS caseworkers and supervisors were either suspended or fired. The city created a data-driven monitoring system called ChildStat in July of 2006, designed deliberately to mirror the NYPD's CompStat. Internal city policy briefs from the period state plainly that ChildStat was drawing on the principles of the NYPD's widely heralded process. The city hired roughly 600 additional caseworkers. According to the New York Times, the average caseload per investigator dropped from 16.5 cases down to 9. The New York City Independent Budget Office documented that the count of investigative caseworkers rose from 898 in June of 2005 to 1,346 by June of 2007. Retired NYPD detectives were brought in as consultants to teach caseworkers how to actually investigate a home. Cesar Rodriguez was tried first. In March of 2008, a Brooklyn jury convicted him not of murder, but of first-degree manslaughter. Justice DeMango sentenced him to 29 years, the legal maximum for that charge. Nixales Santiago was tried separately. Her defense argued that she had been a victim of domestic violence herself, terrified of her husband, unable to act. The jury did not buy the totality of the argument. On October 17, 2008, she was convicted of first-degree manslaughter, 2 counts of second-degree assault, unlawful imprisonment, and child endangerment. When Justice Domingo sentenced her on November 12, 2008, she gave Santiago 40 1/3 to 43 years. That sentence was longer than the sentence handed down to the man who delivered the fatal blow. The judge explained the math from the bench. She said that even if Santiago had not struck the killing blow, Nick's Mary would not have died from that blow if her mother had only acted. She reminded the courtroom that the child had gasped for air and called for her mother twice before she died, and that her mother had ignored those calls. She said that Santiago had a duty to act, and that the duty was the duty of a mother. Prosecutor Amaduimo, speaking outside the courthouse afterward, said the jury's verdict was a good day for children, because the jury had said clearly that parents have a duty that includes acting, and that what a parent fails to do can be as damning as what they do. Nixales Santiago remains incarcerated, currently at Bedford Hills, and is not eligible for release for years to come. Some women on this list killed once. The woman in our next case is connected by investigators to a pattern of small deaths and burning buildings that began the year she was 8 years old. Shirley Winters. There is a stretch of upstate New York counties where, if you went back through the records, you would find a peculiar pattern of fires and missing children stretching across more than 4 decades. House fires, cabin fires, family deaths attributed at the time to electrical defects and to sudden infant death syndrome and to bad luck. The same woman keeps appearing inside those records, again and again, decade after decade, going under different married names, moving from one upstate town to the next. By the time New York State Police investigators were able to put it all together, they had connected her, with varying degrees of certainty, to the deaths of as many as 7 children and to no fewer than 17 fires, 9 of which they classified as arson. Her name was Shirley Winters. Shirley Winters was born near South Onondaga, New York, in February of 1958. The first deaths in her vicinity occurred when she was 8 years old. In 1966, while she was staying at her grandmother's home, 3 of her own siblings died of carbon monoxide poisoning: a 10-year-old brother, an 11-year-old sister, and a 4-year-old sister. The deaths were ruled an accident at the time. Shirley survived. The pattern reasserted itself across the next decade. In September of 1979, 3 children of a family friend died in a house fire in Herman, New York. The very next day, on September 12, 1979, Shirley Winters' own 2 children died in a separate fire at the family's cabin on Hyde Lake in Teresa, New York. Her 3-year-old daughter, Colleen, and her 20-month-old son, John. The fire was blamed at the time on faulty wiring. The following year, in 1980, her 5-month-old son, Ronald Winters III, was found unresponsive in their home in Otisco. His death was attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. Then came the smaller fires and the smaller charges. She pleaded guilty to criminal mischief in 1981. She pleaded guilty in 1997 to setting a deliberate fire at her own late mother's home and served 8 years in state prison. Investigators kept her name in their files. They did not have what they needed to bring a case on the children. That changed on November 28, 2006. A 23-month-old child named Ryan Rivers died at his grandparents' home in Pierrepont, New York, while Shirley Winters was visiting. The death was initially treated as an accident. But this time, with another child dying in her care after a 40-year pattern, the investigation did not stop. New York State Police obtained court orders to exhume the bodies of her own 3 children, who had died in 1979 and 1980. What forensic pathologists found when they reopened those small graves in March of 2007 was what investigators had quietly suspected for 30 years. Colleen and John had not died of smoke inhalation or burns from a faulty wire. The autopsies showed that they had suffered serious injuries before the fire ever started, and Ronald Winters III had not died of sudden infant death syndrome. The medical examiner's office now classified his death as a homicide. On April 24, 2008, Shirley Winters pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter in 2 of the deaths. The death of the toddler Ryan Rivers in 2006, and the death of her own infant son Ronald in 1980. The plea was structured carefully. It gave her concurrent sentences and parole eligibility after 17 years. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue separate cases against her for the 1979 deaths of Colleen and John, and not to seek a sentence of life. Onondaga County District Attorney William Fitzpatrick was openly furious that the case had been resolved this way. He told reporters that Shirley Winters had been good at 2 things in her life, and that those 2 things were setting fires and ending the lives of children. Years later, when her release became imminent, he said publicly that she liked to set fires and liked to harm children, and that whatever was wrong with her could not be cured. Her own surviving daughter, Joy Winters, who as a small child had reportedly been left inside a burning building by her mother and survived only because rescuers got to her in time, told reporters in 2024 that she was absolutely terrified at the thought of her mother walking free. That release came in May of 2024, after 17 years inside, with credit for good behavior. Shirley Winters was not released into the community at large. She was transferred to the St. Lawrence Psychiatric Center in Ogdensburg, New York, where she is currently confined under civil commitment. As of the most recent court filings, the state has not been willing to let her live unsupervised. She is, in the language of her former prosecutor, a person who cannot be cured. The pattern that defined Shirley Winters' adult life was a fire, a small death, and a plausible explanation. What defined our next case was something very different. A single victim, a wealthy young schoolteacher, and one piece of evidence that more than 30 years later is still being argued about in court. Carolyn Warmus. In the late 1980s, a wealthy young elementary school teacher in Westchester County named Carolyn Warmus fell in love with another teacher at her school. The teacher was already married. He told her, the way these men always tell these women, that he was going to leave his wife once his daughter finished high school. On a Sunday night in January of 1989, the man's wife was shot 9 times inside the family's condominium in Greenburgh. Police initially looked at the husband. They eventually charged Carolyn Warmus. A first trial ended in a hung jury. A second trial, with one piece of new evidence that appeared suspiciously late, produced a conviction. More than 3 decades later, Carolyn Warmus is out of prison, and she is still fighting, in court and in the press, to prove that she did not do it. Carolyn Warmus was born in January of 1964, the daughter of a Michigan insurance executive whose fortune ran into the tens of millions of dollars. She came to New York to teach, took a position at Greenville Elementary in the Edgemont School District, and around 1987 began a romantic relationship with a fellow teacher named Paul Solomon, 17 years her senior. The affair lasted roughly 18 months. Solomon, who later said in court that he had been weak and foolish, kept telling her that he would eventually leave his wife, Betty John, a 40-year-old guidance counselor, after their daughter graduated high school. Warmus, by her own admission in interviews from prison decades later, believed him. On the evening of January 15, 1989, Paul Solomon went out for drinks with Carolyn Warmus at a Holiday Inn lounge in Yonkers. They had sex in her car in the parking lot. According to his own subsequent testimony, he returned home to his wife afterward and found her dead inside the family's Greenberg condominium. Betty Jean Solomon had been pistol-whipped and shot 9 times in the back and in the legs. The investigation moved fast. Police looked first at Paul Solomon himself, the way they always do when a wife is killed in a home she shared with her husband. But he had what looked like a usable alibi for the relevant window of time. Investigators then turned, very quickly, to Carolyn Warmus. What they uncovered over the following months built into a circumstantial case that was unusual for its specificity. Warmus had retained a private investigator named Vincent Parco, whom she had paid for unrelated services over a long period. Investigators determined that Parco had sold Warmus a .25 caliber Beretta handgun fitted with a silencer in the weeks before the killing. A call had been placed from Warmus's home phone to a gun shop. Ammunition purchases were traced to her credit cards. Parco eventually testified for the prosecution about the weapon. Her first trial, in the early months of 1991, ended in a hung jury, voting 8-4 for conviction. The judge declared a mistrial on April 27, 1991. The Westchester County District Attorney's Office did not back off. They retried her. The second trial, in 1992, introduced a piece of evidence that the first jury had never seen: a bloody black cashmere glove. Paul Solomon now told the court that he had found this glove in a closet in his own home, sometime after the first trial had ended, when he was packing to move. He turned it over to authorities. The prosecution's forensic experts linked that glove to one photographed at the scene of his wife's killing. Prosecutors James McCarty and Douglas Fitzmaurice built the glove into the center of their case. The defense argued that the timing of that glove was, frankly, impossible to believe. They argued that Paul Solomon, having been suspected himself once, was now framing his former lover to save his own skin. They argued that no honest defendant could be expected to answer for evidence that materialized in her ex-lover's closet after a year of motion practice. The jury convicted her anyway. On May 27, 1992, Carolyn Warmus was found guilty of second-degree murder and criminal possession of a weapon. Judge John Carey gave her the maximum, 25 years to life, at sentencing on June 26, 1992. Warmus served her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She has maintained her innocence from the day of her arrest forward. She has said that if she is guilty of anything at all, it is having believed the promises of Paul Solomon. She was paroled on June 17, 2019, after 27 years inside, and is on parole for life. The case did not end at her release. In May of 2021, the new Westchester County District Attorney Mimi Rocha formally consented to DNA testing on 3 pieces of evidence: the cashmere glove, semen recovered from the body, and blood recovered from a tote bag belonging to Paul Solomon. To date, there is no public record that those test results have ever been released. Carolyn Warmus is now in her early 60s. She has reportedly been diagnosed with a brain tumor and undergone surgeries that have left part of her face paralyzed. She is still asking the courts and the public to look at her case again. Whether they will, and what the lab work will say if they do, is an open question. Even her conviction depended on a piece of evidence with a strange history. The final woman on this list never tried to deny what she did. She walked into a Manhattan police precinct and confessed within hours. The man she had shot survived. The cultural argument over what to make of her has lasted longer than her life did. Valerie Solanas. On the afternoon of June 3, 1968, A 32-year-old woman with a paperback manuscript in her bag rode the elevator up to the sixth floor of a building on Union Square in Manhattan. The building housed Andy Warhol's studio, a place known to the entire art world simply as the Factory. She had been there before, she had appeared in one of Warhol's films, and she had given him a play she wanted him to produce, which he had misplaced. When she stepped out of the elevator that afternoon, she was carrying a handgun, and she was carrying the conviction that Warhol and a French publisher named Maurice Giraudeas had entered into a conspiracy to steal her work and silence her. Within minutes, she fired 3 rounds into the most famous living artist in America. Warhol survived. The cultural fight over what to make of the woman who pulled the trigger has lasted longer than her life did. Valerie Solanas was born in New Jersey in April of 1936. Her childhood, by every account she ever gave of it, was a disaster. She reported repeated abuse by her father. She was pregnant twice before her 16th birthday. Despite all of it, she was an academically gifted student, and she eventually completed a psychology degree at the University of Maryland. She came out as a lesbian in the early 1950s, when the social cost of doing so in the United States was enormous. By the mid-1960s, she had drifted to New York City, where she lived in cheap rooms and panhandled, and where she began writing the document that would eventually overshadow everything else about her, the Scum Manifesto. The manifesto, which she self-published in 1967, was a polemic calling for the elimination of men as a sex. The acronym was eventually glossed as Society for Cutting Up Men, though Solanas herself later said no such society had ever existed. She gave Andy Warhol a copy. She appeared in his 1967 film I, a Man. She gave him a copy of a play she had written, titled Up Your Ass, hoping he might produce it. Warhol read it, found it strange, and lost the only manuscript she had. She also signed a contract with the publisher Maurice Giraudeas for a $500 advance, and convinced herself, in the months that followed, that the contract had given Giraudeas ownership of every word she would ever write. By the spring of 1968, she had decided that Warhol and Giraudeas were conspiring against her. On the afternoon of June 3rd, she went to the Factory at 33 Union Square West and waited outside the building. When Warhol arrived with several associates, she rode up in the elevator with him. Once inside the studio, she drew the handgun and opened fire. 1 round struck Andy Warhol and tore through his lungs, his spleen, his stomach, his liver, and his esophagus. She also shot the art critic Mario Amaya, who received superficial wounds. She turned the gun on Warhol's manager Fred Hughes at point-blank range. The gun jammed. She left the building, surrendered herself to a traffic officer in Times Square that evening, and told him that Andy Warhol had had too much control over her life. The next day, in arraignment, she told the court that she had nothing to regret. Warhol was rushed to Columbus Hospital and underwent 5 hours of emergency surgery. He survived, but he never fully recovered. He wore a surgical corset for the remainder of his life. His art changed afterward, and he became more reclusive. He told friends for years that he had never stopped being afraid. Solanas was diagnosed with chronic paranoid schizophrenia and initially declared incompetent to stand trial. She was committed to the Matawan State Hospital, a New York State psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. In June of 1969, she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of reckless assault with intent to harm. She was sentenced to 3 years, including time served, and was held across a series of state correctional and psychiatric facilities during that period, with her name surfacing in popular accounts alongside the better-known women housed on the Bedford Hills campus during the same era. After her release, She continued to make threatening phone calls to publishers and writers and was repeatedly hospitalized. She spent the last decade of her life moving between Phoenix and San Francisco, often homeless, and eventually settled in San Francisco's Tenderloin district. When she was told, in 1987, that Andy Warhol had died after gallbladder surgery, the Warhol associate Ultraviolet reported that Solanas said only that she did not feel anything. Valerie Solanas died in a single-room occupancy hotel in San Francisco. Her body was discovered on April 25, 1988. The cause of death was bronchopneumonia, complicated by emphysema. She was 52 years old. The fight over her legacy began the day she was arrested and has not finished. Ty Grace Atkinson, then the president of the New York chapter of the National Organization for Women, called her the first outstanding champion of women's rights. The attorney Florence Kennedy publicly defended her. Norman Mailer called her the Robespierre of feminism. The mainstream leaders of now, including Betty Friedan, distanced themselves from her. In 1996, the film I Shot Andy Warhol restored her to public memory. Academic rereadings of the Scum Manifesto by feminist and queer theorists followed. Most observers, including those who admire her writing, reject what she did at the factory that day in 1968. Andy Warhol's body, the one she had altered permanently with 3 bullets, lived for 19 years after she pulled the trigger. He died, in part, of complications that doctors at the time linked to his injuries. Valerie Solanas outlived him by just over 12 months. 10 women, 1 prison, and 10 stories that turned Bedford Hills into one of the most studied women's facilities in America. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.